hired a plumber while my son and his wife were away on a cruise. He sent me a text that made my hands go cold. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm without me noticing. Retired life does that to you. You lose track of time in ways you never expected. I'd spent 31 years as a high school principal in Columbus, Ohio, managing crises, mediating between parents and teachers, knowing when something was wrong before anyone said a word. That instinct doesn't leave you when you hang up the lanyard for the last time. It just sits there, waiting. My son Preston had called me the week before. He and his wife Nadine were taking a 14-day cruise, Caribbean, he said, like it was something I'd be impressed by. I wasn't. I smiled, said it sounded wonderful, and asked about my granddaughter. "Oh, Lily's fine," he said. "She's staying at Nadine's sister's place." Lily was 7 years old. She was the reason I still drove 40 minutes to their house in Westerville every other Sunday, even when my knees ached and the highway felt longer than it used to. She was the daughter of Preston's first marriage, to a woman named Claire who had died of a brain aneurysm 3 years earlier. Sudden, devastating, the kind of thing that doesn't make sense, no matter how many times you turn it over. Claire had been 34 years old. After Claire passed, Preston got sole custody of Lily. There was no dispute. Claire's parents were elderly. Her sister lived out of state. Preston was all Lily had left on paper, and for a while I believed he was doing his best. Grief does strange things to people. I gave him grace. I maybe shouldn't have. Nadine came into the picture about a year after Claire died. I'll be honest, I tried to like her. I really did. She was polished in the way that makes you feel underdressed, always arriving to Sunday dinners with a bottle of wine she'd describe in detail nobody asked for. She wasn't warm with Lily. I noticed that early. But I told myself it was an adjustment period, a new stepmother, a grieving child. These things take time. The cruise was set to last until the following Friday. 2 full weeks. I hadn't been invited over to their house while they were gone, but then I got a call from a neighbor 2 days into their trip. Their kitchen had a slow leak under the sink that had apparently been getting worse. She'd noticed water staining the cabinet below the kitchen window from the outside. Said it looked like it had been going on for a while. She had my number because I'd given it to her years ago for emergencies. I called Preston, straight to voicemail. I called Nadine, same. I tried their house line and it rang until it didn't. They were somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic with spotty reception, I figured, so I made a decision. I still had a key. I'd always had a key, from back when Preston lived there alone with Lily and needed someone who could check in if something went wrong. I called a plumber, a man named Pete who'd done work for me twice before. Reliable, fair price, showed up on time. I told him I'd meet him at the house. We got there around 10 in the morning. The house was quiet, the way houses get when the people who fill them are gone. A particular kind of stillness that you feel in your chest. Pete got to work under the kitchen sink while I walked through the downstairs, just to check on things. The plants needed water. There were dishes in the drying rack. Normal enough. Pete was a fast worker. He had the leak assessed in under 20 minutes and started on the repair. I went upstairs to check if there were any other visible issues. Preston had mentioned the guest bathroom faucet dripping the last time I'd been over, and I figured while I was there, I might as well take note of it. That's when my phone buzzed. A text from Pete. Not a call. A text. I remember thinking that was odd, considering he was 1 floor below me. Mr. Gallagher, I need you to come to the hallway near the utility room. Please come now. I don't want to say this over the phone. I stood there for a second, reading it twice. Pete didn't seem like a dramatic person. He was the kind of man who communicated in estimates and timelines, not cryptic texts. My stomach dropped before my brain had fully processed why. I walked toward the back of the house, past the guest room, past the linen closet, to the narrow hallway that led to the utility room. Pete was standing outside a door I'd always assumed was a storage closet. His face was the color of old concrete. There's a child in there, he said quietly. A little girl. She's awake. She's scared. I don't fully remember crossing the distance between us and that door. I remember pushing it open. The room was small. It had been an office once, back when Preston first bought the house. There was no window. A cot with a thin blanket. A plastic bin in the corner. A small battery-powered lantern, the kind you take camping, and sitting on the cot, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes wide and red-rimmed, was Lily. She looked thinner than the last time I'd seen her 3 weeks before. She was wearing a long-sleeved shirt and leggings that were too small. Her hair was tangled. She looked at me like she was deciding whether she was allowed to be relieved. "Grandpa?" she said. Her voice was barely a sound. I sat down next to her on that cot and I held her. And I will tell you that I am not a man who cries easily. I have buried a wife. I have sat with families at the worst moments of their lives. I have held myself together through things that would break some people. But sitting in that dark little room with my 7-year-old granddaughter in my arms, I came apart completely. Pete had stepped away. I could hear him on the phone in the hallway, talking low and urgent. I didn't stop him. I knew who he was calling. Lily told me things in pieces, the way frightened children do. She'd been in that room since before her father left. She wasn't sure how many days. There was a case of water bottles stacked against the wall that I hadn't seen at first, half depleted. There was a box of granola bars, the cheap kind, the ones you buy in bulk. And most of them were gone. She'd been eating them slowly, rationing them the way a child shouldn't have to know how to do. She told me that when she needed the bathroom, she had to knock on the door and wait. Sometimes Nadine would let her out. Sometimes it was a long time. She said this matter-of-factly because to her it had become normal, and that matter-of-fact tone in a 7-year-old's voice is one of the worst things I have ever heard in my life. She asked me if she was in trouble. I told her no. I told her she was safe. I told her I was not leaving without her. The police arrived before I'd finished saying everything I needed to say to her. 2 officers, then a third. Then a woman from Child Protective Services who had kind eyes and a quiet voice and who sat with Lily while I stepped into the hallway and tried to keep my hands from shaking. One of the officers asked me to walk through what I knew. I did. He took notes. He asked about the parents' whereabouts. I told him, Caribbean cruise, departed 9 days ago, due back in 5 days. He asked about the child's mother. I told him Claire had died 3 years earlier. He asked about custody. I told him Preston had sole custody. Then he asked about the financial arrangements for Lily. That's when it started to unravel in a way I hadn't expected. Claire had taken out a life insurance policy when Lily was born, $400,000, with Lily named as the primary beneficiary. Because Lily was a minor at the time of Claire's death, the benefit had been placed into a trust, with Preston named as trustee. The trust was designed to pay out a monthly disbursement of $1,800 for Lily's care, food, clothing, medical, education, until she turned 25, at which point she would receive whatever principal remained. I had known about the trust in a general sense. Claire's parents had mentioned it to me once, quietly after the funeral. They'd been reassured that Lily would be provided for. We all had been. What I did not know, what none of us knew, was what Preston had been doing with that money. The CPS caseworker made some calls. The detective assigned to the case, a thorough woman named, well, I'll just call her the detective. She started pulling financial records. It took a few days, but what came back was not surprising in the worst possible way. It was confirming Preston had been the sole trustee with minimal oversight. Over the course of 2 years, he had used distributions from Lily's trust to pay for things that had nothing to do with Lily. A lease on a car Nadine drove, a home renovation. The kitchen I'd watched Pete repair that morning was updated with quartz countertops, and new cabinetry paid for with money meant for Lily's meals. Hotel stays, restaurant charges, the cruise itself. 14 days, 2 passengers, balcony cabin, had been booked through an account that drew from the Trust's administrative fund, which Preston had quietly expanded his access to. Meanwhile, Lily's actual medical records showed she hadn't had a pediatric checkup in 18 months. Her school attendance had dropped significantly in the past year. Her teacher had flagged concerns to the school counselor. That referral had gone somewhere into a system that hadn't yet surfaced it to anyone with authority to act. Preston had also not updated Lily's school emergency contact to include me. He had removed my name at some point in the past year. I hadn't known that either. I thought about the Sunday dinners. I thought about how Nadine had started suggesting they meet at restaurants instead of at the house. Easier, she'd said, less cleanup. How I'd stopped seeing Lily's room when I visited. How Lily had seemed quieter than usual the last few times I'd seen her. But I'd attributed it to grief, to the ongoing adjustment of losing her mother. I had attributed too much to grief. I should have pushed harder. I have had to sit with that. The detective reached Preston by satellite phone the following day. He was told to return immediately. He and Nadine flew back, first class, the detective told me later, booked on a credit card connected to the trust, and were met at the Columbus airport by law enforcement. I was not there for that. I was with Lily. She had come home with me that first night under emergency protective placement. A CPS worker had facilitated it quickly given my background, my proximity, and the alternative being a stranger's home. Lily slept in my guest room, which is not a converted office. It has a window. It has 2 quilts. It has a nightlight shaped like a crescent moon that I bought years ago and never had occasion to use. She slept for 11 hours. The legal process moved faster than I expected, possibly because the evidence was not subtle. Preston and Nadine were each charged with child endangerment, criminal neglect, and because of the trust fund misappropriation, felony theft, and breach of fiduciary duty. In Ohio, those last charges carry significant weight. Their attorney tried to argue the trust access was within Preston's discretionary authority. The prosecution's forensic accountant disagreed with enough documentation to fill a binder. My own attorney filed for emergency custody within the first week. I want to be clear about something. I am 64 years old. I have a 2-bedroom house, a fixed income from my pension and Social Security, and 2 replaced knees. I was not the obvious choice for primary guardian of a 7-year-old by any external metric, but I had one thing that the court ultimately weighted heavily. I was the only consistent, loving presence in Lily's life, and there was documentation to support it. Her school records mentioned me. Her pediatric file from the previous doctor mentioned me. Even a card she'd made me for Father's Day 2 years ago was entered as evidence because she'd written inside it, "You're the one who always shows up." A child's crayon handwriting should not have to be legal evidence. But it was, and it worked. Emergency custody was granted within 10 days. Permanent guardianship came 4 months later, after a full home study, background checks, interviews, and evaluation by a child psychologist who said Lily showed significant attachment security with me, and that disrupting that relationship would be harmful. Preston and Nadine both accepted plea agreements. Preston received 3 years in a minimum security facility and 5 years probation. Nadine received 18 months and probation. Their attorney had negotiated reduced sentences in exchange for full cooperation with a financial audit and restitution to the trust. Restitution. The word sounds clean. It wasn't. Nearly $60,000 had been spent from the trust on things that had nothing to do with Lily. Some of it may never be recovered in any practical sense. But the trust itself was restructured, with a professional fiduciary now managing it, and me named as a co-trustee with oversight responsibilities. Whatever is left will still be there for Lily when she's 25. The hardest conversation I had was not with the lawyers or the detectives or the judge. It was with Lily. About 3 months after she came to live with me, on a Sunday afternoon when she was sitting at my kitchen table doing a puzzle, she looked up at me without warning and said, "Why didn't my dad want me?" I didn't give her a speech. I didn't explain addiction or narcissism or whatever clinical framework might apply to Preston's choices. I told her that some people make terrible decisions that have nothing to do with the worth of the person they hurt. I told her that her father's failures were not her fault and were not her story to carry. I told her that she was wanted, that she had always been wanted, that I drove 40 minutes every other Sunday for years because I couldn't imagine a version of my life that didn't include her in it. She went back to her puzzle. A few minutes later, she said, "Grandpa, can we get a dog?" I said I'd think about it. We got a dog 3 weeks later. A 4-year-old beagle mix from the Franklin County shelter named Biscuit. He sleeps at the foot of Lily's bed and has already destroyed one of my good sneakers, and I don't mind at all. Lily started 2nd grade at the elementary school 6 blocks from my house. Her teacher sent me a note home in October that said Lily had been elected by her classmates to be the morning helper, the kid who takes attendance to the office. Small thing, but Lily told me about it at dinner like it was the best news of her life, and I sat there watching her talk with her hands the way her mother used to, and I thought, there she is. There's the kid she was always supposed to be. There are things I would do differently. I would have pushed harder when she got quiet. I would have insisted on seeing her room. I would have called the school myself, on my own, without waiting to be invited into the loop. I was too respectful of Preston's autonomy as a parent at the expense of my instincts as a grandfather. I know better now. I act on what I know. If you are reading this and something feels off about a child in your life, a grandchild, a neighbor's kid, a student, trust that feeling. Ask the uncomfortable question. Make the call that might make someone angry with you. The worst outcome of being wrong is that you embarrassed yourself. The worst outcome of saying nothing is something I don't need to describe, because you already know. Lily is 8 now. She lost her first tooth in November and put it under her pillow. And in the morning she found $3, because apparently the tooth fairy has adjusted for inflation, and also I had no singles. She laughed for about 5 minutes when I told her that. I would go through everything again, every courtroom, every deposition, every hard conversation, to hear that laugh. I've thought about this a lot over the past year. Not the courtroom, not the financial records, not even the moment I opened that door. I've thought most about the years before any of it. The Sunday dinners I kept showing up to. The signs I noticed and talked myself out of, the grace I extended to Preston, because I wanted to believe that grief had changed him temporarily, not permanently. That's the thing about looking back. You see the shape of it so clearly when you're standing on the other side. Preston made a series of choices. Each one was small enough to rationalize in the moment. One missed checkup, one skipped school event, one renovation paid for with money that wasn't his. And then the next choice became easier because the last one had gone unaddressed. That's how it works. Not one dramatic moment of becoming a bad person, but a slow accumulation of small decisions, each one a little further from the person you're supposed to be. By the time Lily was sitting in that dark room with a half-empty box of granola bars, Preston had traveled so far down that road he couldn't even see where he'd started. I don't say this to excuse him. I say it because I think it's important to understand that character doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes. And the same is true in reverse. It builds the same way. One honest choice, then another. One hard conversation you don't avoid. One moment where you act on what you know instead of waiting for someone to give you permission. I spent 31 years watching teenagers figure out who they were going to be. The ones who turned out well, not the ones with the best grades or the most opportunities, but the ones who actually became good. They all had one thing in common. They had developed the ability to sit with discomfort and act anyway. Not because it was easy, but because they had decided that doing the right thing was more important than doing the convenient thing. That's not talent. That's a practice. You build it by exercising it, over and over, in situations that don't feel consequential until they are. Lily is 8 years old, and she is already, in her small daily way, practicing exactly that. She told me last month that a boy in her class was being left out at lunch, and she'd gone and sat with him, even though her friends didn't. She told me this casually, between bites of a sandwich, like it was not a remarkable thing. To her, it wasn't. To me, it was everything. What Preston did had consequences. Legal ones, financial ones, the kind that will follow him for a long time. That's not a punishment I designed, it's a result. The choices he made set those results in motion. And the choices I made, to keep showing up, to hold that key, to trust Pete's text and walk down that hallway, those set a different set of results in motion. Lily in my guest room. Lily's laugh at dinner. Biscuit destroying my sneakers. I am not a perfect man, and I was not a perfect father, but I kept showing up. And in the end, that was the thing that mattered most. Not the wisdom, not the credentials, just the consistent, stubborn decision to be present. That's what I would tell anyone listening. Not a lesson exactly. More like an observation from someone who has lived long enough to watch cause and effect play out in slow motion. You don't have to be extraordinary. You just have to keep showing up, keep paying attention, and act on what you know when the moment comes. The moment always comes.